Hello and welcome to the last episode of this year's The Word for Kids. I'm Jaymie and I've been guiding you through the book of Genesis in a series of 20 episodes. Here we are in episode 20 already. We started with the very beginning, the creation of the earth. Then we talked about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They sinned and ate the fruit God told them not to eat and had to leave the garden. Then they had two sons, Cain and Abel. But the oldest son, Cain, killed his brother Abel when God was pleased with Abel's offering and not Cain's. Time passed and all people became selfish and evil. God was so angry he wanted to destroy the whole earth and everyone on it. But he saw one righteous man named Noah and through him saved mankind. As you know, Noah built a huge ark, took his family and two of each animal on the ark with him, and survived the flood that covered all of the earth. Then the animals and people went out and began to fill the earth. Sometime later, another righteous man arose. His name was Abram. God told Abram to leave the land he was in and go to the land he would give him and his descendants. Abram believed God even though he had no children and therefore no descendants. God made Abram's name Abraham and gave him and his wife Sarah a son when they were very old. They named him Isaac. Then God tested Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Again, Abraham trusted God, and just as he was about to do it, God provided a sacrifice in Isaac's place. Years later, Abraham sent a servant to find a wife for his son Isaac, and God revealed to the servant Rebekah, who was to be Isaac's wife. Isaac and Rebekah had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the oldest, but Jacob tricked his brother into giving him his birthright and tricked his father into giving him the blessing that should have gone to Esau as well. Esau was so angry that Jacob had to flee because he was afraid his brother would kill him. Later, he fell in love with a woman named Rachel and asked to marry her. Her father agreed to give her to him after working for him for 7 years. But when the time came, he tricked Jacob into marrying Rachel's sister Leah instead. So Jacob worked another 7 years to also marry his beloved Rachel. Jacob had many sons. His favorite son was Joseph. But all of Jacob's other sons hated Joseph because they were jealous of him. One time, Joseph had dreams about all of his family bowing down to him. His brothers were angry and sold him as a slave to a caravan of people heading to Egypt. Once in a prison in Egypt, Joseph helped two people, a baker and a cupbearer, interpret their dreams. Years later, Pharaoh had dreams he could not interpret, and the cupbearer remembered what Joseph had done for him. Joseph went to the Pharaoh and interpreted the dreams for him, which meant there would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine in Egypt. Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of handling this situation, and Joseph stored up grain throughout the years of plenty so that when the famine came, Egypt would survive. When the famine did come, people from everywhere came to Egypt to get their grain. Among them were most of Joseph's brothers. They didn't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized them. He sent them to get their youngest brother and kept one of them, Simeon, in jail. Jacob didn't want to send his youngest son, Benjamin, with them to Egypt, but eventually they became so desperate for the grain they needed to survive that he allowed him to go. Joseph then had his servant accuse Benjamin of stealing his silver cup so he could keep him in Egypt with him as a slave. But another brother, Judah, offered to take his place, and Joseph became so overwhelmed that he finally told his brothers who he was. He sent them all back to get his father and their families and returned to Egypt, where he could take care of them and provide for them for the last 5 years of the famine. So, after some convincing and a vision from God, their father Jacob gathered all he had and his entire family and headed to Egypt. Whew! And that brings us up to this last piece of the story of Genesis. Are you ready for today's adventure? Let's go! So Jacob was on his way to Egypt. He sent his son Judah ahead of him to get directions to Goshen. When Jacob arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready for him and went to Goshen to meet his father. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. He had not seen his father since he was 17 years old. Jacob saw for himself that Joseph was still alive, and he too was full of joy. Joseph told Pharaoh that his brothers and father had come to him and that they were shepherds who tended livestock. Pharaoh gave them land in Goshen to use while the famine was still severe. Sometime later, Jacob died. The brothers took him to his own land to bury him and then returned to Egypt. After the death of their father, Joseph's brothers worried that he would hold a grudge against them for the sins they had committed against him. They sent Joseph a message, saying it was the instructions their father Jacob had left for Joseph. The message was asking Joseph to forgive his brothers of their sins and the wrongs they committed in treating him so badly. Joseph wept when he read the message. The brothers then came and threw themselves before Joseph and said, "We are your slaves." Joseph replied, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph chose to glorify God through his life's story. Oh, that sound means it's time for the word of the day.
Glorify. To bring honor or praise to someone or something. Glorify.
Thank you. Okay, so after glorifying God, Joseph spoke kindly to his brothers and reassured them. He told them he would continue to provide for his brothers and their children. Joseph and all his father's family stayed in Egypt, and Joseph saw 3 generations of his son Ephraim's children. Joseph said God would come to his brothers' aid and take them out of Egypt to the promised land, the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He knew he was near the end of his life and had his brothers swear an oath that they would carry his bones up from this place, meaning Egypt. Then, at the age of 110, Joseph died. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt, and that is where our story ends for this episode and for the book of Genesis. But don't worry, the story of Joseph's family isn't finished. Now, it's time for the verse to remember. This week's verse is Genesis 50:24b. But God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. One more time. But God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's family went on to become a nation, and as we've said so many times before, God always keeps his promises. God promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit a special piece of land. He confirmed that same promise to his son Isaac, and he promised Isaac's son Jacob the same thing. It was Joseph who reminded his brothers of this promise and assured them God would come to them and take them out of Egypt and to that promised land. And that is what the next book of the Bible, Exodus, is all about. So next season, there will be another 20-episode series guiding you through the amazing journey away from Egypt through the book of Exodus. Then the next series will cover Joshua, where the people finally do reach the promised land, as well as Judges and Ruth. There is so much more to learn and discover in God's Word. And though these stories happened thousands of years ago, we can find so much in them to help us live our best lives for God today. I can't wait to share with you the next part of God's amazing story for us next year. But for now, that's all the time we have for Genesis' final episode of The Word for Kids.